This is a unique case study in many respects, and I hope to cover how this was unique and how we achieved what Varian wanted to achieve through a rather complicated implementation. That's my picture when I used to look better. And I have my email address just in case anybody wants to get in touch with me. So a little bit about Infostretch. DevOps and quality engineering, particularly in the digital environment. So Varian, in one way, is a good case study when they were trying to kind of implement a lot of their core business processes in systems like ServiceMax and Sales. Of that, we are about 900 people worldwide, headquartered in Silicon Valley. Let's see, and I guess a lot of good stuff, right? And this is about Varian. I hope you know them. They are the world's largest cancer and oncology medical device company and software company, and they make machines to treat patients with for cancer. So they do chemotherapy treatments using their equipment and stuff like that. Pretty mission critical stuff. These equipment needs to be serviced in time or people lose lives. And what we tested had a direct implication on that. They are also being regulated. They also get regulated on some of these business processes, and that's why it was very critical. So I'll be walking through the testing landscape and challenges, what kind of approaches we used. I'll also walk you through solution architecture. This was all entirely done on Tosca, and I'll touch upon some key points on how we leverage Tosca and how we actually technically implemented the solution and what value we were able to derive from that. And so let's get on it. So speaking from the systems perspective, this is what Varian has implemented, right? So it is this plethora of systems implement end-to-end processes across various business functions, particularly sales, service, and certain regulatory aspects of how they track and monitor their business processes, right? On the next slide, I'll walk through some of these systems. But this is pretty interesting in the way that using certain single sign-on solutions, they actually created one application. So it's like a one container of an application which basically pulls in the right app over the web depending on where you are in the business process. So if you are trying to deploy a service engineer to the field, this would span from all the way from doing something in Salesforce, then going into ServiceMax, then releasing some equipment in SAP, going back to ServiceMax and completing that business process. So I'll talk about that business process in a bit. It was unique in quite a few different ways in the sense that just keeping the session across these multiple systems was not just difficult for us to test, but it was difficult for people to implement. And we could see that in the way it was implemented, because often when things moved from one system to the other system, things broke down, right? So it was important for us to test that things moved, the session moved seamlessly from one system across to the other system. They used this Dell Boomi integration technology because they had to integrate data and business process from behind their firewall to the cloud, right? And often there was a lot of complexity in that integration, right? So it had to bring data back and forth between the cloud and behind the firewall in SAP and other systems, right? So these are some of the business processes. Those in the blue are the ones we actually tested. So as you can see, the goal of this Unity system, as they call it, is to cater to sales, marketing, a lot of service management, a lot of management of how they interact with their community, right, and the customers, and certain regulatory aspects. I'm not an expert on the regulatory aspects, but that was certainly very critical to what we tested, right? And like I said, a lot of these processes kind of are interwoven in the sense that, they start at one process and they end at a scenario starts at one process and ends at another process, and that's how complex it is. So what is in the blue here is what we help them actually test and automate. Please stop me if you have any question at any point.
What kind of platform did you test? Was it more like embedded systems, or is it like applications on hardware, or is it only applications?
Oh, this is all business systems. So like we tested workflows that spanned through the system that I showed you earlier, right? So business flows of service and sales that go across SAP, ServiceMax, which is a service provisioning and service management cloud SaaS software, right? And Salesforce, which is obviously a sales and CRM in the cloud, right? So these are all business. We were not on the medical device side. Yeah, this is all on the, but there were still pretty significant regulatory requirement in these processes as well. Sure. Sure, good question. So some of the testing challenges we had, right? Definitely, each of these systems are mammoth implementations in themselves. And when you actually integrate processes across them, it becomes even more complicated because, each of these systems have independent release cycles. Obviously their organization, the companies who build them, release them at an individual release cycle. And all of this needs to be coordinated and stitched together and put it in production in that individual release cycle, still in a coordinated way. So that by itself adds a lot of complexity, right? Varian, through a lot of transformation, by the time we started with them, had started following an agile life cycle, which means they had an ambition to release this workflows, right, every 2 weeks to production, and they were actually doing it. And that's why I guess fundamentally testing this through automation became even more paramount for them because they realized that what they wanted to do couldn't be done manually, right? As you will see, there are over 400 or so critical business processes that they were implementing through this, and there was no way in the world they were going to be able to test this manually every 2 weeks, right? So definitely that agility brings a lot of challenges, and there's a lot of customization, right? So these systems, particularly ServiceMax, SAP, when it comes to this regulated world of what Varian was trying to do, particularly these medical devices or medical machinery that they are servicing in the field, has a lot of unique business cases, and none of these things are like out of the box from ServiceMax or SAP or anything like that. So there was a lot of customization, and even the process of building that customization and deploying it to the cloud was pretty unique and challenging, right? And like I said, all of these combined necessitates the importance of doing automation and testing in a time-sensitive way, right? So I already talked about complex and long test scenarios. I'll have an example on the next slide. Definitely data conditioning and data dependent transactions. So each of these transactions had very unique data related problems, right? So when you create a work order for a machine to be serviced in the field, depending on what equipment you are servicing, the work order can be extremely different from one to another, right? And more often, right, these were not things that these data conditions were not something we could store and save in the system and keep them forever, right? Because not just that these systems were getting updated, but these were very unique situations. So we had to kind of take that into account. The release process by itself is very complicated, right? Because the way it happens in cloud is you do all the development, all the customization on the code that you are doing, you do it on-prem, of course, because your developers are sitting on-prem, and then you push it to the cloud to be tested in multiple environments. So we actually created, it's not a subject of this presentation, but we created a pretty complex CI system for them, because it is one thing to kind of build and deploy this software on-prem, but when it comes to these multiple cloud environments and you're promoting software through different stages in the cloud environment and testing it, it is not a trivial CI exercise. It has very unique challenges. So we actually built a continuous integration system on Jenkins to actually build and deploy into Salesforce, into ServiceMax, and so on and so forth, right? Obviously the regression testing regression testing of software needed to be automated. It was time sensitive, and it had also pretty unique regulatory requirements. And some of these other challenges that I already spoke about. So I'll move on from here. This is an example of a use case, right? So this actually is a use case of creating a service order and deploying a technician to the field, right? To maybe to a hospital to actually service a particular medical equipment, right? And as you can see, it actually spans through multiple systems. Not only it spans through multiple systems, it has data that moves from one system to the other system, and they use Boomi for that. And all these integration pieces are done in a batch mode. They are done on a time cycle, right? So we couldn't have a test case start in one system and then wait until until the data had moved, right? So we had to figure out how to resolve that particular problem. So as you can see that there are various. First of all, this is a very long scenario, right? It takes, if I were to do this scenario manually, it would take about 25 minutes with all the data conditioning and data preparation that I were doing just to execute it, right? So it's a long scenario, and it has a lot of these manual parts or the data migration parts that need to be catered to, right? And there are a lot of validation points, and each of these screens, like creating a work order, has probably easily 30 to 35 different fields that need to be entered, which are sort of mandatory, and there are several other non-mandatory fields, but in order to kind of create a work order, right? So we didn't know when we were actually going into the project, but once we went in, we realized that, oh, this was way more complicated than we imagined it to be. Right. Sure.
Did you deal with the information-rich aspects, like encrypted data into the cloud, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Was it Tosca a good tool for that?
Yeah. So I think all the security aspects and encryption-related aspects were ingrained in the systems that they had built, right? So our objective here was to do functional testing using Tosca. Actually, our objective was to automate functional tests that they had developed, right? So the security aspects, encryption aspects, I'm sure they were very important to them, but they were all implemented as part of the implementation. We didn't have to do much with it.
So they give you like data that was already known and...
They gave us test cases, sort of like half-baked test cases that we actually, completed, and then we automated them. That's what was our SOW, right? Here are the test cases. Make sure that the test cases actually work first, and then automate them. And also that was one part, and the other part was the CI thing that I talked about. That was our scope. Sorry, maybe I should have covered that, right? So the approach we used was this. We actually did a parallel, agile life cycle while implementing this thing, right? So we did a sprint zero, which we aspects of what was going to be like the core architecture of this system, right? Which is fundamentally how do we deal with data, how do we deal with reuse related problems, because the wrong thing would have been, and again I'll touch upon the solution in a little bit, but the wrong thing would have been to actually code all of these test cases as if we were seeing it for the first time. There was a lot of reuse, a lot of components in each of these test cases that could be done in a modular way. And I'll talk about how we did that in a moment. But we did in the sprint zero, we did all of that. So by the time we were done with sprint zero in about a month, we were ready with what the test architecture was going to be, a proof of concept of how this thing all will come together, etc. Right? And from sprint 1 onwards, in an iterative way, right, we followed through creating the test cases. So like I said, the test cases were kind of half-baked to begin with. So we completed the test cases, we got them approved through the business, and then our automation team kind of came one sprint behind, and they automated the backlog that the subject matter expert, like our test expert, was creating these test cases in, right? So that's the process we followed. So every 15 days, we were delivering a big chunk of test cases automated to them. I mean, developed and automated. And the test development and test automation was following like one sprint behind, right? And we use Jira to actually manage all of these things. So here's the broad test architecture, right? So as you can probably see here, right? So we definitely leveraged reuse in terms of creating these test steps. And the purpose of these test steps was to, so first of all, we created test modules, right? So in Tosca terminology, these test modules, or the model-based concept, actually allows us to capture the screen. So if I am on the work order screen, for example, I would create a module for that, and I would reuse it across all my different test steps which are likely to use that module, right? So we created these test modules sort of in isolation. So we considered that as an asset, and then we created these test steps which create a work order would be an example of, right? And we combined all these test modules and test steps in a test library. And the whole idea was that we would be able to spin off these test cases using these test steps, right? And the purpose there obviously is that if anything changes, say in the screen or in a particular step like creating a work order, the change is very local to that particular step. It is not that we are having to change all the different test cases, right? So that kind of brought in a lot of reuse, and all these test steps were parameterized to begin with so that we can push data into it. And then using the test templates and the test case design approach, we basically created test templates, and we drove all the test cases through the data and executed that through CI. And we generated these DocuSnapper documents that we were able to kind of give to the customer and say that, okay, look what this test case executes as, validate that, and sign it off, right? So that was our process, right?
I have a question. Did you find a lot of issues or any issue with using your... Yes, my question is, when you created the library, because I'm not very familiar with that, did you find a lot of, was it very straightforward to be able to use that library, or did you have to rework that library in order to create new test cases?
Yeah. So I'll touch upon some of the issues that so in the following slides, I have some of the issues that we ran into and how we addressed them, right? So obviously there were problems, challenges that we had to resolve with respect to process. Of course, there's a whole lot of technical challenges that we addressed, and issues related to test data and environment. So I'll briefly touch upon a few of these. I'll move a little bit faster because I realize I have a little bit less time. So the process-related problems were fundamentally around, first, the test cases. There was a whole life cycle of test cases that need to be sanitized and got approved from business, right? So in a typical IT organization, right, there is that by itself is a cumbersome and a bureaucratic process that we had to go through. Nothing related to automation or task around that, but that just by itself was complicated. But this process that we followed about creating a backlog of test cases that are sort of approved, and then automation team coming in one sprint behind helped us a lot, because we were always able to keep the backlog full by doing that early on, right? There were a lot of frequent system updates. That was expected, and we knew that. And as we were actually automating the test cases, things were changing, right? So again, this reuse thing that I talked about, where test modules and test libraries were all reusable components, helped us quite a bit, because anytime something changed, the change was very localized to one particular thing, right? But things did change quite a bit. And capturing this snapshot of a test case executed was important because we didn't want to create a situation where the test case ran fine and then eventually somebody came back to us and said that, oh, this thing doesn't work, right? So we used DocuSnapper to capture that and give it to the customer and say that, okay, this is the proof that we did it. You can approve it based on that, right? So real quick, here are some of the areas where we used Tosca well, and I'll go through some of that. I probably won't be able to go through all of it. One thing we really loved about it was it's a one-stop test tool, right? So unlike you have ALM and you have another test automation tool, and for APIs you have a different tool, and for version management or configuration management you have a different tool. This is really a one-stop shop. So we could do everything all the way from configuration management, required management, test data management, test repository, API testing, service virtualization, everything we could use one tool for. And our team really appreciated that, right? And I think my second point covers that. GUI test. So we used all of these concepts. Of course, bulk of this was GUI testing, but we had a lot of API tests because all of these batch processes that I talked about were pushed or were started through an API. And again, we used Tosca to use that. I already talked about reuse and maintainability. In terms of challenges, we had a lot of challenges where certain objects won't get recognized, right? So to give you an example, we would have a calendar object done in one of these tools, ServiceMax or Salesforce, I don't remember which one, but no matter what we do, right, we can't recognize that through Tosca. So we actually had to extend Tosca by writing a DLL, right? And I won't go into too much details, but we were able to basically enhance Tosca such that it was able to recognize that particular thing as one object. And that came in quite a bit handy. We used test data and parameterization to the fullest. By the time we were done, we had in excess of 300 test cases, and we identified a risk associated with each of these test cases. So when we created a regression suite through CI, we were able to shortlist a number of test cases that we could run as part of that particular execution, right? I already talked about continuous integration and test run logs. So I have a few screenshots about API testing. So this just shows that we actually used made all those requests to Boomi using the API tests in the system. This is the object recognition test module thing. I think one of the really cool things that really helped us was that as system changes and something kind of a particular object is not recognized, the tool tells us that these are the 6 objects that are kind of out of sync, right? They call them unmapped controls, and you can kind of rescan them quickly and build that repository really quickly before even a test breaks. So otherwise, in a normal test process, a test breaks and then you have to investigate why did the test break, and you recognize that, oh, because this object repository has changed, that's why I have to go and fix that. But here we could do that all proactively, right? I already talked about the test library. So all of these things were actually created as a test step that was reusable. This is parameterization. Again, I think nothing fancy about it, except that each one of our test case was parameterized to the extent that we could really consider all aspects of test data separate from the test cases, right? Here's an example of that calendar control that we could not recognize. This was like identified as a div before we did customization, right? And we wrote a DLL which actually extended, and once we drop it into Tosca, it was able to recognize that particular thing as one component, right? I think I spoke quite a bit about data and integration challenges. Fundamentally, by extracting data from test cases, we were able to meet both of these issues and leveraging APIs. So closing in, we automated, we did, like I said, there were two aspects of this effort. One was building this whole CI solution. So we did that using Jenkins, and using Tosca, we automated about 320 scenarios. It was very typical for a test scenario to execute for anywhere from 10 minutes to 20, 25 minutes. On an average basis, this is about 19 minutes for one test execution, right? And we were executing the whole regression officially 2 times a month, but unofficially it was run almost every time they put something in the QA environment, right? And we had about 35% reduction in just the human resources cost. Not to mention the effort that one takes to kind of do the repeated investigation and repeated preparation one has to do to execute these test cases, right? So this is the overall outcome. The whole process was about less than 6 months. So I think we have all these tests now running repeatedly, and right now they have one person who's doing continuous maintenance of these test assets, right? That's it.